Welcome to today's discussion. Today we have an exceptional panel, and I'm really excited about this topic because it's something that I'm super passionate about. We'll be discussing the importance of supplier transparency and risk monitoring in achieving sustainability goals. I'm delighted to be with you today to share our thought leadership and our approach to achieving supplier transparency and to monitoring ESG risks in today's complex supply chains. Let's get started with a few questions here. So this issue is so common in many different sectors. And we want to dive in a little bit further as to why this is so important. So AJ, let me start with you. Why is transparency into supplier relationships so important?
Yeah, no, great question, Marie. And I think it's a great one to start with. So when we think about transparency, we're really thinking about driving that ability to adjust when disruptions occur, right? So as we think about, the pandemic or wars and disruption within our supply chain, it's really that transparency allows us agility to really make better supply chain and supply planning decisions. And ultimately, at the end of the day, reducing risk and being compliant is also an ability within that transparency lens.
That's great. Thank you, AJ. And I know this is there have been so many supply chain issues that were highlighted by the pandemic. And then now with geopolitical tensions around the world, those seem to have gotten even more exacerbated. Jonah, let me turn to you because I know you probably have a slightly different viewpoint coming at this from a sustainability perspective and a climate perspective specifically.
As Marie said, I do come at this from a little bit different perspective. And as we looked at the participant list, we have folks from internal, external audit, supply chain, risk, procurement, all coming at this from a different context. And when we talk about transparency, that might mean different things to different people. So for me, I might be thinking about supply chain data and transparency, trying to decarbonize a supply chain, and that transparency would allow me to identify, the intensive aspects for your Scope 3 emissions. My co-panelist Mihir, he comes maybe from more an operations view, so he might be looking at that transparency data to help him remediate a specific issue that you might be having with a supplier and finding a replacement. So when we talk about transparency, it's good to come in kind of all with the same definition, but noting that there's different flavors. And I'd say at its core, it's really knowing kind of who, what, and where, and all of that with what's going on in your value chain. So the origins, the movements, who's handling products, what facilities are involved, all the way from, the raw materials and commodities down to your final customer.
So Mihir, let's turn to you. Why is it so hard to gain visibility into these supplier relationships?
I mean, as you started with, with the presentation, that the supplier networks of today is really very complex, right? So you might know your immediate tier 1, tier 2 supplier, but then that same tier 2 is buying products from a tier 4 supplier, which might be a direct supplier to your tier 1. So the complexity in the current supply chain networks makes it extremely difficult to just have any sort of visibility and transparency into where your products are coming from and how they're built and where they're built and stuff like that. The other thing that we have been hearing a lot these days is the information gap and the limited transparency in terms of not all suppliers have equal incentives and motivation to provide you all the information that you guys need, right? So that's where the gaps comes in, and it becomes very difficult to okay, where did this product came from, or what did the supplier use to provide us this component of your component within your supply chain. So I think those couple of things makes it really complicated makes it really hard right now to gain visibility.
Jonah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Mihir hit it on the head. All of those different factors kind of compound against each other to make it really difficult. I'd say one thing is the kind of a large manual undertaking of trying to get a handle on your supply chain. And currently companies are doing things like surveys and audits, and all of that takes a ton of time and is very difficult. So yeah, I think Mihir hit it.
And when we think about Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, emissions especially, why is it hard to gain visibility into that information from a supplier ecosystem standpoint?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing is it's such a nascent market. Many companies haven't begun to calculate their Scope 3 emissions, and even if they haven't calculated it, they haven't reported on it publicly. So I'd say the data isn't necessarily out there. If you were trying to find your supplier's emissions, they might not know them yet. So it's really hard in this kind of early stage to get a good handle on your Scope 3 emissions. And there's many different ways that you can estimate that or look at it from a sector perspective and get a good kind of calculation that might not be exact. And we'll talk about some of the regulations coming out in later in the webinar. But from what I'm seeing is in the future it will get easier because there are a lot of regulations coming out where companies are going to need to report on these emissions. So I think it's looking up from a difficulty standpoint.
Yeah, that's great observation. So AJ, what are you seeing in the market related to what companies are planning in this space to try to solve these problems? And just give us a high level, because I think we're going to go into a lot of detail on this later in the webinar, but what are some immediate reactions from you on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Marie. So as we think about what people are doing, right, it's very difficult to, where do I start, where do I prioritize? So really what we're seeing is that segmentation of your supplier and your third party population is critical in understanding, who are my most critical suppliers, who are my highest risk suppliers to my organization, and really starting there. And ultimately, we're starting to look at external data providers are getting richer with those areas of data. And really, ultimately, at the end of the day, there are going to be a requirement or a need for humans in the loop to do, these audits and assessments and due diligence as well. But that external data is really giving us an upper hand and an advantage of being more efficient and effective with this process.
What about you, Mihir? What are you hearing from your clients?
So I would say, apart from what AJ mentioned, employing risk intelligence at their company level, right? It's not just looking at the data, but how you make sense of that data, not just about collecting that data, but how you employ that data to identify risk early in your supply chain, or just to identify risk that potential risk that could impact or that could have disruption in your supply chain. So I think that would be another thing that is one of the other things that we're hearing a lot these days.
Okay, great. So AJ, give us a couple examples of key risks that you see associated with supplier relationships.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's kind of two ways to look at it when we think about risk of third parties, right? It's the risk to my organization, but also the risk of that company continuing to stay viable in a supplier for us. So as we think about internally, you're looking at, concentration risk, business continuity considerations. And then when you kind of look at the supplier lens, you're starting to think about their financial viability, their cybersecurity, if they're accessing our systems, for example, their reputational risk because they are connected to us as our suppliers. And then, we've talked about it, but some of those ESG risks as well.
Okay, great. And Jonah, as it relates to supply chain risks for you, can you help us specifically understand some supply chain risks related to sustainability topics?
Yeah, and AJ, thanks for that lead in with the ESG risks. I think that in terms of ESG risks, the environmental risks are a little bit different, and the social and the governance risks tend to get evaluated a little bit more together. So from an environmental standpoint, you're looking at things like resource depletion, physical risks to your operations. So we do a lot of work on company supply chains. That's why it's important to know who's handling your goods and what facilities they're at, because you think about drought or flooding or water scarcity, or in California, there's laws about extreme heat days when workers are allowed to be working in the warehouses if it's too hot. And those are going to get more common as the years go on based on all the climate models we're looking at. So knowing where your facilities are, knowing what your supply chain looks like will allow you to better plan for those environmental risks. And then for social risks and governance risks, you're looking at things like workers' rights and forced labor, compliance with regulations, which we'll talk about some of those later, and then governance. You have management and oversight risks like corruption and bribery, and I think that relates really well to the topic we're talking about today of supply chain transparency, because one of the biggest governance risks is a lack of supplier transparency and supplier management, and that would fall under kind of a governance failure.
That was really comprehensive, Jonah. Thank you very much. Let's move on now and kind of talk about the changing landscape as it relates to regulation. So, in the past, companies are doing this for potential optimization purposes or to align with goals and targets and commitments that maybe they've made from a sustainable supply chain standpoint, or maybe to avoid certain crises associated with supply chain issues that were noted by their company during the pandemic. But what we're seeing coming out of all of that is a significant amount of regulation. And so, Jonah, I want to go back to you to kind of cover, what are we seeing? What are some of the most important regulations that our audience should be aware of as they're thinking about this topic?
Yeah, you're exactly right in that what used to be driven by commitments or maybe even goodwill or mitigating risk is now business imperative. In order to do business, you're going to need to comply. So a lot of these regulations, and those three on screen, I'd say might be the big three if you're based in the EU or the US, but there's many, many more. I know India, Australia, South Korea, there's probably a dozen more. And they vary in kind of scope and target. I'd say one of the broadest, most applicable ones is the one in the middle here, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which you may know by a couple other names. It's got acronyms CSDD, CS3D, CSDDD. They all kind of refer to the same thing. But that's kind of a much broader one aimed at mitigating and tracking any negative kind of human rights or environmental impacts in your supply chain. Whereas you also see very targeted ones like the UFLPA in the United States saying that you cannot import any goods that have suspicion of forced labor, or you have to prove to a reasonable standard that there was no forced labor used in any goods coming out of the Xinjiang region of China. You see new ones, like I mentioned earlier, the California state bills, SB 253 and 261. Those are U.S. based, but they involve reporting, so your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And when you get into scope 3 emissions, you're going to need some transparency into your value chain and calculating those emissions. I'd say that, the great thing about all of these regulations is that they're mitigating harmful effects on people in the environment and ensuring sustainable business practices. The tough thing is that there are so many of them. And they're new, they're changing, and that they're tough to keep track of. I was just on a call recently with a client based in the Northeast U.S., and the client just found out that they were subject to a Canadian reporting standard, that they had been for years, but they just weren't aware of it. And she had a great quote, which was, if I can't keep track of the standards that are 100 miles from my office and written in English, how am I supposed to keep track of the ones that are not written in English and are across the world? And I think that's a common sentiment that we're seeing is all these new kind of patchwork of standards and regulations are coming out. So there's some growing pains, and we'll talk about ways that we can help companies with that. But one other good thing with the patchwork is that there is a ton of overlap between them. And what we're talking about here with supply chain transparency, if you have a good handle on your supply chain and the transparency, good data, good management, you can ensure that you're compliant with these regulations with pretty minimal business impact.
That's great, Jonah. Thank you. And just to point out, some of these new regulations come with annual reporting requirements as well, particularly CSDDD, right, in the EU. So companies need to start being aware of making sure they have the people and infrastructure in place to meet those reporting requirements.
And one of the good things, so that the CSDDD reporting requirement, will come into effect at different rates for different companies. It depends on kind of how much revenue you have in the EU or your headcount, and there's different qualifications for different sizes of companies. But I think that the biggest thing you can do to get proactively ahead of some of these is to do kind of a regulation scan and see what's out there on the horizon, look at which ones apply to you, and then prioritize which ones are coming first or which ones have the largest penalties. And I think that's a good segue into this slide on some of the penalties.
Yeah, absolutely. Mihir, do you want to cover some examples of what the consequences are related to poor supplier visibility?
No, absolutely, yeah. So I think from an extreme lens of just how it could affect your company's growth to the other end of the spectrum, like how it could completely destroy a company financially. Like some of the examples you're already seeing on the screen, but one that is very close, I would say physically, because I'm from Florida, like I'm currently in Florida, and this one is about a company based out in Jacksonville in Florida. Like recently, about a year back, U.S. Custom Borders and Protection seized over 1,000 shipments of solar equipment, including one of that from Jinko Solar, because they were in violation of UFLPA laws that was introduced, that was enforced. And so for this company, which is not a big size company, they were about to get a 2.3 million grant from Jacksonville City. And now because of this violation that was encountered, that was discovered at that time, they lost that grant, right? So this is just one example, but you can see it can clearly have financial distress on you. It can have laws and penalties lawsuits and penalties that affect your company's image, that affect your company's growth, and it can give you a really massive supply chain disruption as well. So the spectrum is huge, but the penalties are really it can be damaging sometimes.
So Jonah, can you walk us through a couple examples here?
Yeah, I think Mihir had a good one there with the UFLPA, and we were recently working with a large apparel company that was also kind of worried about the UFLPA compliance, and we were able to kind of help them proactively think about how they would respond to this. So we went through a fun exercise of kind of pretending to be Customs and Border Protection and picking a random shipment of theirs and saying, this has now been stopped at the border. What are we going to do? And I think that was a really valuable exercise to see kind of, did they have the info that they needed? How difficult and how quickly could they get that info and be able to package it and share it in a meaningful way with CBP? And since we've worked with some other large companies that have gone through the actual process of having goods stopped at the border, we were able to play that role and help this large apparel company make sure that they were ready before it happened. And they were, they're pretty mature in their level, but I think that's one of the best ways to look at some of these regulations and think, what would I do if I was in that situation?
Let's move on to the second part of our presentation and how to really leverage data and analytics for helping to create transparency and understand supply chains. So let me go back to you, AJ, here first. Help us understand first, what are some of the challenges that our clients are seeing related to gathering and using data to manage their supply chain risks?
Yeah, so as we think about that data side, there's data from the third party, but then there's that external data concept as well. So some of the challenges that we see are simply receiving that data and the validation or validity of that data. But the other that is becoming, more and more apparent as external data providers are becoming richer with that data is this concept of that translation layer. And what does it mean to my organization? So it's critical that if you're using external data providers, that you have a risk methodology in place to say, when I see these type of scores, these type of flags, if you will, what does that mean to my organization? And what are those next best actions that truly I need to achieve to get comfortable after we've identified those risks? And that's oftentimes, where organizations fall down is we receive a bunch of data, but we don't know how to catch, receive, and interpret So building that up front is critical to the success of usage of those data providers.
And not to mention that a big concern here is the quality and reliability of the data you're receiving from third parties is often like not reliable. So how do you deal with that, AJ?
Yeah, so as you think about that, it again goes to data is not everything, right? There's always this concept of we need to be involved, assessing, auditing, being part of the process, and really mitigating some of those false positives by simply talking to the third party and validating some of that data. What that external data provides you is an indicative view. And really, if you want to go to that layer 2 or layer 3 deeper, it's going to require some of those conversations with those third parties.
Yeah, that's a foreshadow. So for what we're going to talk about in a few minutes is, not just relying on the data you're getting from third parties, but doing some validation using an outside-in approach. So thank you for that, AJ. Mihir, let me go to you. What challenges do you see companies have related to gathering and using this data? And what are some better practices that you're seeing companies employ to figure these challenges out?
Yeah, no, the couple of them that comes to the mind is like one, as AJ was mentioning, right? Like it's not just about getting the data, but like how you translate that into your system, into your company is like one of that is identifying the false positive, right? Like you might have a good data source from external parties or from third parties data that you're collecting, but identifying that, okay, this one is actually a problematic supplier versus this is just a false positive, like that we have been seeing as a huge pain point across different system, across different clients. The other one that comes to the mind is just the manual process of collecting the data, right? Like companies are dependent a lot on supplier surveys, supplier audits, and oftentimes these are self-reported. The other challenge that comes with this is like your suppliers are like way far in a different world altogether, different country, and you do not have local support to ensure that the data that you're collecting are accurate. So to mitigate that, like some of the best practices that we are currently seeing is like, having automation through smart contracts and other technologies that can provide you data and that you feel like confident with leveraging in your risk methodology, in your risk intelligence calculations and stuff like that. Also, just as AJ was mentioning, like leveraging external third-party data, like totally independent third-party data can be a huge plus if you are able to get that kind of data into your system. Obviously, the challenge with that is like it's super expensive. It's not everybody can afford it, and so like making sense of like making a business case out of it, a cost benefit analysis out of that is a huge thing to ensure that you're leveraging that data properly into your system. You're able to identify risk using that, and you're able to solve some like manual data and like data quality concerns that are there within your supply chain.
Okay, great. So Jonah, what are you seeing in terms of how our clients are doing this well? Like how are they identifying and managing risk, and what are some examples of that?
Definitely. I think AJ and Mihir brought up some good examples about using technology and data, and the two that I would add would be integrating your data in your systems and real-time monitoring and tracking. So with the integration of data and systems, we'll see often clients as they mature, they start to leverage the data that they already have much better. And oftentimes when we think about supply chain transparency, that supplier information might be collected by procurement as they're doing their due diligence on a new supplier, and they're getting great information about their operations and their locations and headcount and their ownership structure and their top risks and things like that. But it's not always shared with the other people in the business who might need it, like compliance and risk, or myself as a sustainability professional. I hate to feel left out, but oftentimes that data doesn't always make it over to the sustainability team as they're trying to publicly report on some of those regulations, like we talked about, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So I'd say one of the best practices is integrating that data and systems and making sure that everyone who needs it at the company has access to it. And then another best practice, I would say, is the real-time monitoring and tracking. And this is another one that fairly mature companies are doing well. And, these are companies that have already mapped their supply chain, so they know their list of suppliers and their suppliers, all the entities in their value chain. But things like, if one of those entities gets added to a denied party list for one of the regulations that we talked about above, how long does it take you as a compliance officer to know about that addition? And there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of service providers that can help with that, but ensuring that you are not manually responsible for keeping track of all these things. And it would be a Herculean effort to know all of your suppliers and if they're on a list or not. So that real-time monitoring and tracking is another best practice.
Okay, great. So building on that, we did get a question from the audience that I was hoping, AJ, you could help us with. Is there a way to continuously monitor supplier certifications, such as ISOs and SOC reports and related licenses?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple ways to do it. I think one is there are tools and technologies out there and data providers where you can see those levels of certifications and licenses. But as a simple practice that I've operated as well is when we're doing our level of due diligence or onboarding a supplier, we're obtaining those certifications or those licenses, and we are actively monitoring when those trigger points are that those may expire. And then part of our reassessment process or revalidation is getting that updated certification and making sure that's part of that revetting process, if you will.
What about, AJ, just building on that with the drive for responsible procurement? How do we deal with existing long-standing third parties where maybe the contracts don't have some of the clauses legally embedded around driving towards what you're saying? Like, how do you see companies deal with that?
No, that's a good question. And I think it's important, when we think about supply chain risk management, third-party risk management, that there are so many parties involved, right? So you think about your business continuity, your supply chain operations, contract management. So really, it's important that life cycle is complete when we think about those longer standing suppliers, and that those risk management items that we're identifying are making their way back into those business relationship owners' hands to articulate and drive new contract SLAs and manage the contract appropriately. And then as you think about when those come up from a revetting process and looking at the length between your onboarding due diligence and your reassessment is also critical in that process. As you continue to mature this, you may want to start thinking about those higher critical risk third parties that have been long-standing relationships and revetting them if they have not been vetted in a while.
So let's move on to learning about some innovative solutions for a multidimensional connected risk approach. And we've gotten a few questions around this, so it's going to be teed up nicely. And earlier in the webinar, Mihir kind of talked about, compliance and legal might own a couple risks over here. They might own sanctions and ABAC. And Jonah talked about how he can be left out from a sustainability perspective, and maybe they're only owning forced labor and greenhouse gas emissions tracking. And, we have IT who's owning cyber. So I guess how are you seeing companies solve this issue in a practical way, AJ, like being proactive in what is this connected risk approach that we have up here on the slide? Explain this to us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as we think about the connected risk approach, Marie, you described it very well. There's a lot of different risk management organizations within our overall business structure. And the goal is really to drive that single pane of risk as we think about our suppliers and even internally. So really the steps that we help clients take is really starting to build a vernacular that is similar, right? Because when we talk to cyber, they may have a way of risk ranking their suppliers. We may talk to ESG, they may have a way of risk ranking suppliers. But the importance of driving the connectedness gives us a reason or an ability to look at and say, these are my critical riskiest third parties holistically across all of our risk domains. And without that, we may have gaps within our process, gaps within our supply base that we're not aware of because they've never materialized to a level of risk that we're concerned about. But if you start to add those areas up, you start to realize, oh, that is a risky third party because they were moderate in cyber, moderate in financial, moderate in business continuity, and now they may be a critical or a high risk third party. So it is important to have that single pane or that holistic view of risk, and that is something that we strive to help our clients with every day, is building that similar vernacular so that we all understand what critical is, high is, low is, and are able to very quickly get to that next best action because we all speak the same language and approach the risk and the methodology the same.
That's great. Thanks, AJ. And from a governance standpoint, I think what we're seeing is either a SteerCo approach or a third-party risk management program in the second line or even in the first line to kind of handle these cross-functional risks and come to a decision that's practical for the organization. But Jonah, let's go to you. Can you just give us one first step in identifying the risks that you want to even manage? How should companies go about doing that?
Yeah. From a sustainability standpoint, for those that don't really know what ESG stand for, here's where I would start. I think it starts with defining what your risk methodology and your taxonomy is going to be. So looking at, the universe of risks that might be applicable to my value chain and see which ones are most material. For a soft drink company, they're likely worried about food commodities like sugar or water scarcity. Or, a professional services firm that has a net zero commitment, they probably don't care as much about water usage and are more worried about the price of carbon or renewable energy credits, and if there's a massive shift in that price, how it affects their bottom line or their ability to meet their net zero commitment. So I think that first step is just figuring out what should I be worried about and what is applicable to my business operation.
So Mihir, help us get into a little bit more detail on this approach. How does data, technology, tools, and people that we have up here on the slide, how does this approach work across those dimensions and across these different risk dimensions?
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as Jonah mentioned, we start with developing that risk methodology, right? Once we have that established, we can jump into the data itself. And I think the very first step in the data is having if you are trying to identify a risk, you need to have a good data, and that starts with having a list of suppliers, having their locations and stuff like that, because the very first thing that most of these systems do is do an entity resolution, so they can connect the suppliers in your list with the supplier with the list of organizations across different third-party data sources. And when I say third party, it's external data sources, because those do not use the same terminology, probably do not use the same language. And so it is very important that we are able to clear this first step of entity resolution. Once we have that down to entity level details, we can go into the next step of relationship mapping, where basically you are mapping your supplier to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and that can happen through various different sources, either a relational database or some sort of organization structural database, and any sort of beneficial ownership database that you have across those different third-party external data sources. After moving from after having that relationship mapped out, you can go into identifying the risk itself, right? Now this will go back to step one that Jonah mentioned of what is the risk methodology that you're employing, what are the risks that's applied to you, and then you're trying to identify those potential risks within this relationship that you have mapped across your supply chain from tier 1 to tier N. That will give you an understanding of across your supply chain at which tiers you have potential risk and who all are the risk risk creators or risk violators and companies like that, right? So yeah, this is like very step-by-step approach. We cannot jump on one step before the other, because if you do not have entity resolution, you are probably not going to get a really good relationship or supplier mapping database, which is very important to identify like where the risk lies within your supply chain.
Okay, great. So I've got to first figure out what my supply chain map is, and I can only do that if I know who my tier one suppliers are, and then I map through the value chain to and then apply my risk methodology to potentially identify some of these higher risk suppliers. So then what, Jonah? Like, I know my high risk suppliers. Now what do I do about that?
Yeah, great question. What do I do with it? And not all risk flags are created equal. So what we would do is risk score those different entities. You've got your priority, your high risk ones. We can go through and start to bucket them into different types of risks. And just because a company has come up with a risk flag, it doesn't mean that they were, actual offenders or that you should necessarily cut ties with them as a supplier. And from a sustainability standpoint, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive actually states that the best practice is not to necessarily cut ties if a company was an offender, particularly in a forced labor context. It's beneficial to then work with your supplier, work with that company to mitigate the offense and ensure that it doesn't happen again, which is great, and that you're making real change in the world. That's one example. I think from a broad standpoint, once you have that list of potential suppliers that are high risk, you can do some enhanced due diligence on the most high risk ones in batches. And I think typically that just starts with desktop research and saying, hey, we should dig a little bit more deeper into these specific companies. If you do find something through that, then you might want to do some further enhanced due diligence, with phone calls or audits, on the ground research. And then if needed, you can do remediation like I spoke about with that forced labor example. And finally, I think you get into that very mature stage, which is the ongoing monitoring stage, where you've already kind of mitigated the high risk ones and you're just kind of looking out for new ones that come.
Okay, great. So here's some example outputs coming out of a process like what the three of you just described. Do you want to walk us through this, Jonah?
So I think these will be outputs of like that initial diagnostic. Like Mihir said, we've taken maybe our 1,000 key suppliers and we've blown that out into 2 million different relationships, and we've scored them. So this is what you might see once you've gotten that score back. You'll see your prioritized list of the highest risk suppliers, and you'll see a summary of that risk. I think the one in the top left, which you may not be able to read, but I think it shows like X number of companies have ties to Chinese state-owned entities, or this person who's on the board of company Y that you buy your polysilicon from, he has been accused of corruption and is on this U.S. sanctions list. So you'll be able to see in detail like what the flag was to know what you might want to do with it afterwards. So that's more like the executive discussion. You can walk through that, talk through it in a workshop, but you also get that detailed data that we talked about for supply chain transparency. It's incredibly valuable to know your like full relationship mapping. So you'll be able to see, who your supplier is all the way out to the nth tier and follow the chain of who they're buying from and they're buying from, which, allows you to put that into those ongoing monitoring systems, and to keep track of them. So this is kind of the first look at what you might get. And then there's a lot that you can do with it depending on who you are, if you're compliance or risk or sustainability. There's a lot of exciting things you can do with this information.
Okay, great. So AJ, what would a company think about in terms of some things they could do with these outputs? And does that vary based on the maturity of the organization's supplier risk management program?
Yeah, so as I think about the outputs, it's really critical to think about and prioritize those outputs, because oftentimes what we've seen is there's quite a lengthy list, right? So thinking about prioritization in the short term is really critical, regardless of maturity of the organization from a risk management perspective. And I think working with a the business relationship owners of, and when I say that, I mean who is actively working with that supplier, who is their procurement, etc., and really starting to understand and unpick some of those observations that were identified. Think about the long-term impacts or the long-term approach. It really goes back to what I described earlier about that holistic, connected risk and connected, organizational approach, and bringing that back to the contract management, our quarterly business reviews, and using this as a way to create, better contracts, better SLAs, and allow us to really mitigate that risk through contract management.
Let's move on. We have a case study here that I wanted to make sure we touched on at least briefly. So maybe let me start with you, Mihir. Can you share like a real story about how you worked with a client on this topic, and how did it work out in terms of this diagnostic that you performed?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, the case study that is up here on is like, it's a great example on how we leverage some of the tools and technology that we have internally to help client in understanding their business and understanding their ESG risk properly, right? And more particularly for this particular client, one, they had recently announced a pledge of zero tolerance on forced labor issue. And so like this was very critical for them to understand any forced labor risk within their supply chain. They wanted us to help them with an outside-in diagnostic to review their supplier risk. And so we went ahead, started understanding their supply chain first and collected some data, more particularly data related to who their suppliers are, what products they are buying from them, where are they in terms of geography and like locations and stuff like that. And then with the tool that we recently talked about, or the diagnostic approach that we recently talked about, we leveraged that, starting with entity resolution, trying to map all of their suppliers. Like they had about 30,000 suppliers, and that came out to be, as Jonah mentioned, like about 2 million relationships in total. It was like just the sheer processing power that was required. Like it took us about a couple of days to do entity resolution, because each entity is mapped or is looked into 7 or 8 different data sources that we have, and we tried matching with that. And so like that was a very Herculean task. And then like once we had that entity resolution completed, we went in trying to understand their supplier mapping. We identified a lot of different types of supplier located in different region, and just different types of relationship, right? Like one of the output that you saw on the previous slide, the Sankey chart that we had, like that became a very powerful tool when we showed it to our client. They clearly saw like how 2 of their tier 1 suppliers were buying products from an nth tier supplier, which is the same supplier for both of them. So the risk level hits at different, because like if that one nth tier supplier or tier 4 or tier 5 supplier goes out, you are affected by your 2 major tier 1 suppliers. And so like once we did that high level supplier mapping resolution, we started going in depth of like entities of like enhanced due diligence, like did adverse media screening, trying to identify like what different types of risk comes out in the media screening. Other than that, we looked into different beneficial ownership structure to see like how much of it is like owned by state, how much of it is owned by different people who are on a sanction list, different individuals who are on sanction list, and things like that, right? They were also very worried, like at that time the Ukraine war had just begun, so they were also very worried about like how that could affect or impact their supply chain. And so like when we finished our outside in diagnostic, we were able to identify some really cool risk that the company were not even thinking about it, right? Like one of the code that you guys see here on the screen is like they were very surprised how we did this without any supplier surveys or any supplier input, because without that, it is very difficult. And then again, like even if you're dependent on the supplier risk, you have to validate that data, which was not possible without all of this external third party data.